Well, John, where did John Gobellie enter the first lap of the human race? What was the town and what was the date?
I was born in Lakewood, Ohio on February 13th. It happened to be a Friday in 1920.
So you just had your 89th birthday.
I just had my 89th birthday.
Yeah, that's great. And did you do your growing up then in that same little community?
Until I was 17 years old. And then we moved to Kentucky. My father was with IBM, and he was transferred to the Cincinnati office as manager of the office, and it was following the worst flood that they ever had in Cincinnati. The Ohio River had flooded and flooded out much of the housing, and we found a house over in Kentucky,
just across the border.
River. Yeah. So that's where I finished my last year of high school.
And tell us how it came about that you decided to go in the military. Was that at the invitation of an uncle, or did you beat him to the punch?
We were in World War II, and I was in sort of the wind-up of my college. And so when I graduated from college,
Where'd you go to school?
I went to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And when I graduated, I was commissioned in the United States Navy as an ensign. And I was sent to Harvard to go to the Navy's communications school there.
And that was in what year?
That was in 1944.
Okay.
1943, I'm sorry, 1943. In July, I reported to Harvard.
So our involvement in both campaigns were about midstream at that point.
Yes. As you know, we're fighting war on two fronts.
Right.
We had two wars going, one across the Atlantic Ocean and one across the Pacific Ocean.
So following your schooling then at Harvard, what played out?
I was sent to the port director's office in New York. There were 90 of us, 32 from my class and others brought in from the fleet, to go through a special training in merchant ship communications. At the time, we, as you can imagine, fighting wars across two oceans was a big problem of getting war materials to the troops and getting troops there. And the German submarines and the Japanese submarines would sit off our ports and sink the ships as they came out. And so the Navy started putting ships together in convoys and surrounding them with destroyers and sending them out that way to protect them from the submarine attacks. We were trained to go to 90 ports throughout the world and handle all the merchant ship communications, the convoy communications out of those ports. I was sent to San Francisco, and all the convoys out of San Francisco went out with my communication plans.
So describe for me how that would work. With the merchant ships, which were civilian ships, were they actually camouflaged with troops aboard, or did they escort the battleships and the other military vessels in the midst of the protection there?
The primary convoy assemblies were supply ships, and they were not camouflaged. They were ships that had been built very rapidly by Henry Kaiser, called Liberty ships, and later a more substantial ship that was called a Victory ship.
Okay.
And the troop ships were faster ships, and they usually went out single or with an escort.
And that kept them from being easy target then?
Right. And as the war wore on, our efforts in combating the submarines was improving too. I know off the East Coast they used the Goodyear blimps to patrol the East Coast looking for submarines.
Is that
and
right?
when they'd find them, they'd sink them.
So before they were a commercial portion of a golf tournament on Sunday afternoon, they had a real functional role to play.
They did. And one of my fraternity brothers served on one of the blimps, and he said that it was very difficult on the eyes because they were staring down at bright water, and it was a hard duty for them.
So you were in San Francisco in that operation, and for the duration of the war, did you stay there then?
I was there for the duration of the war. I made one trip out to the Hawaiian Islands because radar was a new instrument during World War II, and every Navy ship had radar, whether it was what we call a rust bucket, supply ship or tanker, it had radar. But we sent troop ships out with 4,500 troops aboard with no radar. And this bothered a sidekick of mine and I, so we negotiated with the Army, and we got a radar set that they had discarded, and we installed it on the Matsonia, which was one of the troop ships in the Pacific. And they had difficulty with it, and after the first trip out, I made the second trip out with them to see if I could solve the problem.
And you did?
Yes, I did.
That must have given you a sense of satisfaction.
Oh yes, yes. I had a lot of satisfaction from what I contributed to the war.
And as a young man, how old were you when you actually were commissioned as an ensign?
I was 22 years old.
So
23 years old.
A young man,
23.
aware of just what the United States was involved in. Did you feel that we were justly involved in both the European and the South Pacific War?
Absolutely. All the propaganda in those days were in that direction. I can remember seeing a movie, newsreels, where they'd show Japanese as being very fierce-looking and mean-looking people. And we were all conditioned to the idea that we were fighting a holy war.
Right, yeah. How was your worldview, your perspective towards life shaped during those years in the military? What lessons did you glean from that really have stayed with you the rest of your life?
That's a difficult question. I probably was thrust into a leadership position earlier than normal. Every convoy went out of San Francisco. They had a communication conference, which I led. And I remember one incident where I directed the audience, which included the signal personnel, the radio personnel, and the captains of the ships and the captain of the defense ships, the destroyers. I directed their attention to something about my plan. And the Commodore, who was the port director of San Francisco, invited me out in the hall after the meeting. And he said, "Young man," he said, "you never direct the attention of superior officers. You can invite their attention, but you don't direct their attention."
Interesting.
And I learned a life lesson from that.
Were you married at this time?
I was single when I went through Harvard and when I went through the training in Port Director's Office, New York. And I met my wife in New York. And then I was transferred out to San Francisco. And after 9 or 10 months, I bought her an engagement ring and mailed it to her and asked her to come out and marry me, and she did.
How about that?
Yeah.
So would you call that a mail order bride? Not quite.
Not quite. When I was in New York, I really had no intention of marrying. I wasn't in the marrying mood. And I met my wife, and she was a very beautiful young lady, and
she still is.
And I fell in love with her. And I decided then that I wanted to marry her. And so I'd write her a letter every night from San Francisco. And every payday I'd buy a charm for her, charm bracelet, and send it to her. And eventually I bought a diamond engagement ring in the ship service office on Treasure Island in the Navy, and mailed it to her and asked her to come out, and she did.
Would you say you directed her attention or you invited her attention?
I invited her attention. Definitely.
And I think we've talked earlier, and somehow the that wonderful hotel over in the Berkeley Hills factors into your relationship somehow.
Yes. We were married at Grace Cathedral up on the top of Nob Hill in San Francisco, and it was a wartime wedding. There were just 4 of us. One of my officer friends was our best man, and a young lady that lived in the guest house I lived in was our maid of honor, and the 4 of us went over to the Claremont Hotel in Oakland for our wedding dinner. And it was a wartime thing. We didn't have family with us. The transportation was just not available in those days. My wife had trouble getting a train ticket to come to San Francisco because most of the trains were being used for troop movements. But she had a friend that worked for one of the railroads, and she was through the friend was able to get a ticket on the train.
Now, the way in which that you met Carol, I think, is an interesting story, probably worthy of spending a few minutes talking about.
Well, I was a typical young man. I was interested in girls, and the Delmonico Hotel in New York had an officers club. And evenings I'd go to the officers club and I could dance with the young ladies from New York. And I met a young girl who was daughter of a Dutch attaché. Her name was Joan Reimers, and she worked for the Netherlands Information Bureau where my wife worked. I didn't know Carol at that point, and I happened to be in the Rockefeller Center one day, and I stopped up at the Netherlands Information Bureau to say hello to Joan, and there, standing next to her, was my wife. I immediately invited her out that evening. We went to the officer club at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and had dinner and danced, and she won me immediately.
Now, someone told me that she, and I don't even know what it means to have been a debutante. Was that a phrase used to describe a certain caliber of woman that was a cut above the rest?
Yeah, but most of the girls at the Delmonico Officer Club were young society girls from New York whose mothers felt that they were doing a patriotic thing by allowing young Army and Navy officers to dance with them. And Carol was not a member of that group, but she was a friend of Joan Reimer, who I had met.
Who was?
Yeah, who was. And And through Joan, that's how I met Carol.
Had Carol competed in any beauty pageants or anything?
Yes, they were holding a United Nations beauty contest in New York, and Joan persuaded Carol to go to it. She didn't want to go, but Joan was persuasive, and so on their lunch hour they went over. And here's all these contestants who have prepared for this, and Carol was pushed into this, and in their normal street clothes, and won the contest. And she was a Miss United Nations.
How about that?
As a result, she was courted by the executive of 20th Century Fox and offered a starlet contract. And she gave that up to come out to marry me. And it took a while for her mother to get over that. But she preferred to be with me than to be in Hollywood.
And you guys have had a wonderful life together.
Wonderful life together. We've been blessed many times. We have 3 sons and a daughter and 7 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. And our life has been a wonderful life.
What, understanding that this videotape will one day be viewed probably after you have changed your earthly address for a heavenly one, anything that you would like to go on record of saying that really is meaningful to you, that you'd like your kids and grandkids to heed as something that means a lot to you, that you'd like them to always remember?
I have tried to instill in my children and grandchildren the importance of integrity. It's a winning attitude, and to always be true and be faithful to the Lord.
So not only to your fellow man, but to the Heavenly Father as well.
Yes, definitely.
Integrity cuts both ways.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
Are you ready to meet the Father in heaven?
I am. I came close one time. In 1975, they discovered I had a brain tumor. And the night before I went into surgery, I said a little prayer, and I said, Lord, I know that your will be done. If I had a choice in the matter, I would like to remain on the earth because I have 3 children who are still dependent upon me. But if that is not your will, then I hope that your face is the first thing that I see. And with that, I went sound asleep. I am not a good sleeper, but I slept that night. And the next morning, when my oldest son and my wife were there to see me off to the operation, they remarked about how peaceful I looked. And I've always felt that the Lord answered my prayer.
Amen.
Yeah.
It's been a challenge for you to walk through this situation with your son Scott, who has a cancer that's kind of rare.
Yes.
Has this experience brought the 2 of you close to each other?
I would say yes to that. We've always been close with all of our kids, but when I visit Scott, which I do regularly, he holds my hand, and I read to him, and he seems to enjoy that.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
What a great bonding
Yeah.
thing. When my dad was quite ill, we held hands, and I really treasure the memory of those moments that we had together.
Yeah.
Well, John, what haven't we talked about that you'd like to kind of go on record as having recollected a memory of earlier in your life, or a memory of your dad or mother? Anything that you'd like to share?
Well, I think I've said enough, but I had a wonderful youth. My first 9 years of my life, we lived in Lakewood, Ohio, on a street, fully occupied all the neighborhood. There were no vacant lots. There were no playgrounds. And our standard Saturday was to collect bottles and turn them in for the deposit to get the price of admission to the movie theater to go see the silent serial movies that they showed in those days. And my father and mother decided that was not the way for a young boy to grow up. I had one brother. He was 2 years older than myself. And so they searched and found a house on the bank of a valley, a river valley in Rocky River, Ohio, which was also a suburb of Cleveland. And I really had a Tom Sawyer type youth. We in the summer, we wanted to go swimming. We'd go down the river, just take our clothes off and jump in. There was nobody around, so
why not?
We'd skinny dip.
Yeah.
In the winter, we'd toboggan down the hills or ski down the hills. And one spring, my brother and I went out and tapped the maple trees in the area and collected the sap. We kept a big wash tub full of sap, and my mother wouldn't let us boil it on the stove because gas was expensive in those days. So we built a fire in our side yard, kept stoking it until we boiled that sap down to maple syrup. I raised rabbits. One spring we set up a trap line, and I was fortunate or unfortunate enough to trap a skunk. After carrying it to the house and hanging it in a tree in the side yard, and went to school, and the teacher sent me home because I didn't pass the smell test. But I had a wonderful youth, and I'm very happy about that.
Your dad got kind of in on the ground floor of IBM, and
he did,
didn't he?
He did. He had started with them in 1912. He was an engineer from, graduated from Case School of Applied Science in Cleveland, and he was a service. He was the second person hired in the Cleveland office as a serviceman to service the IBM machines. And about 1970.
In those days, were they like just adding machines? Is that what they were?
Well, they were a punch card machine. It was an invention of Dr. Hollerith, who had been the director of the U.S. Census. And the U.S. Census would take 10 years to accumulate the information. And so he devised a punch card device that they could use to conduct a census. And it became a tool that corporations could use for accounting. And my dad left him in 1917, and later became a salesman in the record business, Columbia Records. In those days, we didn't have radio, and records were the means of home entertainment. In 1932, at the beginning of the worst depression in our history, Columbia Records went out of business. And my father was looking for a job in Cleveland. He walked by the IBM office, and the woman that had been hired as secretary, the one hired just before him, was still there. He stopped in to say hello to her. And she said, well, so-and-so is upstairs. Why don't you go up and say hello to him? My dad went up to the district manager, and he said, what are you doing, Bill? And he said, well, I'm looking for a job right now. And he said, well, why don't you come to work for IBM? So my dad did, and they sent him to the sales school in Endicott, New York. And he broke all sales records in Cleveland. So they made him manager of the Cincinnati office. And during the war, after the war, he was, or during the war, he was moved to the Milwaukee office and then retired from that office. And so that's the story.
Great story.
Long, but
What did you
sorry
do
about
for
that.
most of your professional life after you got out of the service?
Well, Carol and I and David, our 5-month-old son, moved back to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I had always had the desire to have my own business. So I started out, and I didn't have enough experience to make a go of it. So I was offered a position as sales manager of a company that made outboard motors in Milwaukee, and I went to work for them, and subsequently went through some other positions, and finally set up my own business in Chicago, and which I operated for a number of years.
What kind of business was that?
We were selling all the periphery equipment required for IBM systems, the file cabinets, the key punch desks, card racks, control panel cabinets, all that sort of thing. And we were the #1 office for Tab Products Company, who was one of the companies we represented. And the computer came out during my business career, and we got into installing computer floors, and we became the biggest in the nation in the computer floor business. And in 1975, I had this brain tumor removed, and as I laid in the hospital bed, I felt that I'd been in Chicago for 23 years. I felt I'd plowed the furrow as deep as I wanted to plow it. And so we still had 2 children that weren't emancipated. We had a little 23-foot trailer, and we hooked it up to our car, and we headed west. And we explored the West Coast between San Francisco and Seattle, and decided to settle in Seattle. And since then, I've held different positions. Was regional manager for Aflac, the duck.
Yeah.
and I was regional manager for a company that built homes, and wound up as operating a X-ray lab in Eugene, Oregon. My son is an orthodontist, and he wanted some equipment that was too expensive for one doctor to handle. So we set up a public lab, and I operated it for 13 years, and then I retired.
You did it remotely while living here?
I commuted between here and Eugene for 3 years.
How about that?
And that wore kind of thin.
I bet.
And so we bought a house in Eugene and moved down there, and rented out our house in on Finn Hill in Kirkland. Yeah, and then when I retired, I fulfilled an ambition I had in my life. One was that I go back to all the places I'd been in my business career and spend enough time to see them. And so we bought a 40-foot fifth-wheel trailer, bought a Ford heavy-duty 1-ton truck to pull it, and we spent 3 years touring the United States.
What a
Staying wherever we wanted as long as we wanted, and then moving on. And it was a great experience.
It's been a wonderful life, John.
It has been. I've been many times blessed.